I'm Shant, and welcome to the Friendly Urbanist, a channel where we rethink the urban environment with solidarity and sustainability in mind. We talk about affordable housing, transit, inclusive cities, and much more. Thank you for joining me on the Friendly Urbanist YouTube channel. Some time ago, I saw a video circulating on social media about Montreal titled, "I visited the best city in North America." The asterisk next to the word best caught my eye, and I thought to myself, what better opportunity to make my first reaction video than one about the city I was born and raised in. So let's jump right in. First of all, the video is created by a channel called Not Just Bikes, which off the bat is great because it addresses something that is often neglected. People that advocate for better transit in cities forget that bikes alone are not the solution to traffic issues. Or transit issues in general. Removing all cars from your road network and replacing them with bikes is not only unreasonable, it will also exclude a large number of people who can't or just don't want to use bikes to get around. So the best transit cities are often those cities that combine multiple modes of transportation in order to service their populations, and this often includes private transportation. So without further ado, let's jump right into the video and see what it's all about.
Montreal has a pretty good public transit system, especially for Canada. The metro is made up of 4 lines with a total of 68 stations. The trains come as often as 2 minutes during rush hour and every 3 to 10 minutes off-peak. This makes it very easy to get around by metro, even if you need to change lines. Some of the stations even have cross-platform transfers to make transferring even easier. I'm a big fan of these.
Yeah, I love those.
In general, the system is clean and fairly well maintained, and I used it a lot while I was visiting. One thing that's quite unique is that the Montreal Metro uses trains with rubber tires rather than steel wheels like a typical train. This is because the Montreal Metro is based on a technology used in Paris. In general, Quebec prefers to implement technologies from France rather than the US and Canada, both for practical and political reasons. I thought that rubber tires would mean that the trains would be quieter, but they're really not. However...
Well, yeah, rubber tires are very unique in the North American context, and it's true that in 1967, when the Metro was inaugurated in Montreal, it decided to use, the planners decided to use rubber tires just like the ones in Paris. There are many reasons for that. It's not just political. The reality is also that the entire Montreal Metro network is underground. So you won't need to deal with adverse weather that steel wheels handle better than rubber tires. Also, there's a lot of change in slope in Montreal when it comes to the metros. So rubber tires handle changes and variations in slope better, and they brake better. Another fun fact about the Montreal Metro is that the tires are rubber, but they use wooden brake pads. And those brake pads are lubricated using corn oil, which makes for a very unique and delicious smell when they break, kind of like popcorn. So that's something you now know.
These are some of the most reliable metro rolling stock in the entire world, so there are definitely benefits to this approach, but it gets better. There are big plans in Montreal to extend the public transit system through a new automated light rail system called the REM. When completed, the REM will be a comprehensive light rail system connecting Montreal and some of the surrounding cities. And although NIMBYs managed to cancel the eastern portion, most of the system will be opening in 2024. The first small part of this network had just opened a few weeks before I arrived, so I had the opportunity to ride it, and it's pretty great. The trains are bright and spacious, and the ride is comfortable. The stations have platform screen doors, which are important for safety, but also for reliability, as they prevent anything from falling onto the tracks. And the trains have level boarding, which really should be the norm for every new transit system everywhere. The trains are also driverless, which is really nice to see. There are so many metro systems in the world, including Amsterdam, that are struggling to keep up with demand because of a lack of drivers. So it's good to see Montreal building a driverless system from the start. But the best part of driverless trains is that you can sit up front and pretend you're driving. Whee!
Yeah, I totally did that 100%.
The REM vehicles are basically
and you can't underestimate how cool it is for kids to enjoy
these vehicles
public transport in
to
that
keep
way.
up with future demand versus building a standard metro system instead, but I'll leave that discussion to RM Transit, who has covered this project extensively, links in the description.
Oh yeah, I love
One
Iron
of the
Transit.
most
Great channel.
impressive parts is that the construction of the REM only started in 2018, and the first branch opened in 2023, which is pretty fast construction, proving that new transit projects can be built quickly with enough political will.
That's the key.
Now, when I judge a city, one of the first things I look for is how easy is it to get from the airport and into town? Specifically, is there a high-frequency rail connection to the rest of the city? Unfortunately, Montreal fails this test, and the only public transit from the airport is this clunky bus, which is really not good enough. However, I'm very happy to see that there are plans to extend the REM trains to the airport by 2027, so hopefully this situation won't be around for much longer.
Yeah, it's good that he brings it up because not everything is rosy. It's true that it is absolutely embarrassing for me to, invite people over to my city and have them take a really what's basically a city bus from the airport to downtown Montreal, about a 40-minute ride in regular traffic, really. It's very shameful, it's very embarrassing, and I'm really happy that by 2027 we're going to get rid of this problem because it's not fun to see. Compared to Heathrow Express, for example, or even the tube from Heathrow is much better.
The biggest difference you'll see between Montreal and other Canadian cities is the type of housing. In short, the missing middle isn't missing here. In most Canadian cities, the majority of residential land is zoned only for single-family homes. These are the only type of homes that can be built there, which leads to this crazy situation where you will see only single-family homes and condo towers with almost nothing in between. Many cities are finally realizing that this is a ridiculous situation, though it took a serious housing crisis for anyone to do anything about it. Toronto, for example, has finally made it legal to build this kind of housing again.
So for those who don't know, missing middle is referring to a type of density when it comes to housing that's not exactly high tower condo buildings and not single family houses. It's in the middle, so you'd have your duplexes, your triplexes, your 4-unit buildings, your 6-unit buildings, etc. So for me, as a land use planning expert, this is such an easy win for cities to implement. It's a matter of political will and being able to implement changes in the zoning bylaws that allow for some really reasonable density buildings. And we're not talking about putting high-rises next to single-family housing. We're talking about putting a duplex or triplex nearby. You should get rid of all, if not most at least, if not all, of the single-family zoning. It's just a waste of space, really. And this makes it better for businesses, a lot more foot traffic to businesses in the area, makes public transport more efficient, more riders use it, less cars, less traffic. It's pretty much wins across the board. So really you have to overcome that feeling of NIMBYism when it comes to building, really reasonable human scale density next to first single-family housing.
Montreal is a glimpse of what similar cities could look like in a few decades if they eliminated single-family zoning. This means that for most of Montreal, there is sufficient density to allow for efficient public transportation and enough foot traffic to support a multitude of small businesses.
Yeah, exactly, that's what I was talking about.
Montreal is also becoming very well known for its cycling infrastructure. The city has over 900 kilometers of bicycle lanes, and many of these lanes have been built in just the last few years. When I visited, I was very fortunate to be able to ride around with Stéphane Blais, one of the engineers who helped design a lot of this bicycle infrastructure. So I learned a lot about not just what they built, but why and how they built it the way they did.
That's fun.
I rode around on the Montreal bike share bikes called Bixi. These are great for casual use. Like many bike share systems around the world, the system uses an app to unlock a bike from the dock. There are even e-bikes available too, which came in handy several times. But if you e-bike in Montreal, you are required to wear a helmet, and that includes the Bixi bikes. So I bought one at a local bike shop. Which honestly was fine, because there were several times where I didn't feel comfortable cycling without a helmet. I guess living in Amsterdam has made me soft. The bicycle infrastructure in Montreal varies greatly in quality. The older infrastructure is mostly just paint, but the newer stuff is quite a bit better. Although this one is one of the first bike paths that the city ever installed in the 1980s, and it's better than a lot of the stuff that came later. Some quiet residential streets just have signs allowing side-by-side cycling. Several one-way residential streets have these contraflow bicycle lanes. It would be nice if people cycling could always go the opposite way down a one-way street, but Canadian cities don't seem to like that idea, so these dedicated
Fair
lanes
enough.
are useful. And in this case, the bike lanes also narrow the street, which is best for safety anyway.
Definitely.
It was also nice to see that some streets had temporary cycling infrastructure to make it safe during construction. I didn't see a lot of places for bicycle parking, but what I did see was decent. This bicycle area outside of one of the metro stations was definitely the best one I found.
Mm-hmm.
The most impressive neighborhood for cycling is probably Plateau Montréal, where the main street has been recently converted into a single lane of traffic in both directions with protected bicycle lanes on either side. This is part of the REV, a network of express bicycle routes across the city. These are marked clearly in blue so that they are easy to follow. You can see here where the REV diverts off of the main street with the blue paint and blue sign showing which way to go. Some of these REV lanes are very wide when the street allows for it. And these bicycle lanes are mostly designed for long-distance travel by bicycle. Only a very small portion of this network has been built, but the city plans to extend it by 2027.
Yeah, so I'm glad he talks about the REV, because the REV is an excellent kind of network of high-frequency, high-traffic bike lanes that take you pretty much across the city, or plan to take you across the city by 2027. What is important to mention, however, is the reference he's making to Saint-Denis Street, the main street in Plateau Mont-Royal, where the REV has a large chunk of it. Renovating that and building the infrastructure associated with the REV in that area was extremely controversial. A lot of businesses closed down. The process took too long. There was a lot of missed economic opportunity there. And what people didn't understand and what confused a lot of people was how that would be implemented, considering that right next to Saint-Denis, a street to the east, you have Barrie, which is not as arterial as Saint-Denis, doesn't have as many businesses. And there's a bike lane there too. So people were starting to question, why would we have one bike lane and the second one next to it within a dozen meters or so from one another? So that was very controversial. A lot of people didn't understand why that was done in such a way. It wasn't communicated very well either. It was kind of largely just imposed without much conversation with the local businesses and without being very transparent about what the duration of the work would be, and that cost a lot of hardship for a lot of people. So important to mention that the REV is a fantastic idea, but it's not without controversy.
The reason why this rapid change is possible at all is that Montreal is governed very differently than most other Canadian cities. The island is not actually one city, but instead 19 boroughs and 15 cities that cooperate at various levels. This means that any decision on local issues, such as installing a bicycle lane or pedestrianizing a street, only needs to be agreed on by the local borough and not the entire city. This is why in Montreal, you will see neighborhoods like Plateau Montréal building out cycling infrastructure and safer street designs much faster than many other Canadian cities. One of these streets in the Plateau, called Pine Street, even though it doesn't have any pine trees on it, was recently redesigned. And you can see the direction that Montreal is going with its new infrastructure.
Okay, I got to stop it there because I have to clarify something. Montreal, when it comes to politics, is an absolute mess. It's a function of centralization, decentralization, merger, demerger, kind of trying to put all these different municipalities on the island together and then separating them because people didn't like the idea. It wasn't done very well. It's an absolute mess. In fact, Montreal has more elected officials than Toronto and New York City combined, which is absurd. We have in Montreal 5 to 10 times more elected officials than the average city of the same size, which makes decision making very difficult, very long, requires a lot of different steps. The reason why Plateau Montréal is so quick in making its infrastructure decisions is because everyone elected in that particular borough isn't the same party. So everything is rubber stamped, everything is very fluid. But when you get to areas where the borough council is divided, it doesn't work as well. Where you get areas that are further out from the city and there's a different party, it doesn't, they don't communicate well with the city center, with the mayor's party, etc. So it's an absolute political mess. And if there's one thing I could wave my magic wand and fix, would be that, because it causes a lot of obstacles when it comes to coherent infrastructure planning across the board.
It's a two-way street with one lane in each direction for cars. There's a buffer with trees between the street and the bicycle lane, and the bike lane is pretty well designed with curb protection from cars and another small curb up to the sidewalk. You can see that this design is getting much closer to a proper Dutch-style street design. There are a few quirks though. These look like Dutch-style continuous sidewalks, but they're not. They were intended to be proper raised crossings, but due to compromises in the implementation, they ended up falling short of sidewalk level. You can see how they dip down and aren't continuous at sidewalk level at all. This is a good example of how difficult it is to change decades of car-centric thinking at all levels of government, but at least they're making progress. Some of these more recent...
I want to stop it there just because it's not a question of having car-centric thinking. It's a question of when was that infrastructure built? When did Montreal expand so quickly? And the reality is that Montreal's economic expansion happened in the automobile golden age. So it's normal that all of this infrastructure was built centered around the car. And if you want to change that, it's not just a question of changing how you think, but it's also a question of organizing the entire revamping of your infrastructure, which takes a lot of resources and a lot of time. You can't just snap your fingers and say, well, now everything's going to be about pedestrians or cyclists if all your infrastructure is already built up. It's a gradual transition of what you have as built infrastructure for its own purpose, that transform it into its new purpose, which would be whatever you decide as a society would be appropriate in that area. So I don't really like the way that he's insinuating that the only reason that cycling isn't taking over or the infrastructure isn't being built because people think that cars are central. It's not necessarily the case. You inherit a bunch of infrastructure that you try to adapt to your current needs.
Does provide a much better pedestrian experience than most US and Canadian cities too. There are even some new crossings like this one, which are similar to the designs found in many cities in Europe. You can see here how the road narrows before the crossing, and there's a refuge island between the two car lanes, so that people walking only need to focus on traffic coming from one direction at once. I've been told that Montreal drivers often do not stop for pedestrians, but at this crossing, almost all drivers stop, proving once again that road safety is less about bad drivers and more about bad infrastructure.
Yes,
These crossings also make space for native trees and plants, improving water absorption. One other thing I really appreciate when walking in Montreal is that drivers are not allowed to turn right on red lights. Allowing drivers to turn right on red is insanely dangerous to pedestrians, and this is something I've talked about in previous videos. Another great feature of Montreal is the green alleys. These are alleyways between houses that have been turned into places where kids can play, with very low car speeds and lots of greenery. These can be very easy to overlook, but I managed to find them in many different neighborhoods in the city. And of course, there are also several public parks. A lot of people told me I absolutely must check out the parks in Montreal, but to be honest, I'm not really sure why.
Who told you this?
Montreal has several parks, but I wouldn't say they're any more or less impressive or more plentiful than in most other decent cities.
That's fair enough.
Some are big and some are small, and that's the parks of Montreal. They have been doing a better job than other Canadian cities at removing cars, though. Toronto might want to take the hint and get the cars out of High Park. But the absolute highlight of my trip was streets like these. Every summer, Montreal pedestrianizes about 10 streets, but these aren't just short spans from street to street. Some of these are dozens of blocks long from strode to strode. I cannot stress just how unique this is in Canada or in the United States. Sure, you might find a small pedestrianized street here or there in other cities in North America, but nothing comes even close to the number and length of these streets in Montreal. I saw people of all ages out enjoying themselves and waiting way too long to buy bagels, although they are great bagels.
Excellent.
The streets were decorated with art and random quotes. There were lots of temporary installations for seating, greenery, and just fun things to do. Chairlifts on the street, sure, why not? It was interesting to see that these pedestrianized streets still permitted cycling, but inline skating and skateboarding was not allowed. Mopeds were also not permitted. And this sign mentions a pickup service for the physically disabled and the elderly.
It's hard to overstate how great pedestrian streets are. Everybody benefits. You enjoy the weather if it's nice weather. Most of the time it is. The businesses benefit from more traffic, so more money. Transportation is improved because of less car traffic. It's safer, and you have a lot more things to do and things to see. You actually enjoy your time shopping and walking downtown. So yeah, absolutely, pedestrianize as many streets as you physically can, especially in the summer, because our summers aren't exactly very long.
Cars through, though, and there were temporary bollards to direct traffic, which led to some strange bollard placement when surface parking lots needed to remain accessible. Some of the barriers were very solid, while others were not, which is how they allowed for necessary service vehicles to access these streets. I think the city has done a great job at designing these, given that everything is temporary and needs to be removed at the end of the summer. It was great that I got to experience these pedestrianized streets while I was in Montreal. I really enjoyed them. So that was my trip to Montreal.
I enjoy them every summer.
Isn't this an amazing city? And that's where this video could end. In fact, that's where almost all urbanist content about Montreal ends. Maybe there's some vague references about how the city isn't perfect, it's still North America, but that's about it. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to talk about some pretty major shortcomings I found during my time in Montreal.
Okay.
Things I haven't really seen mentioned in any other urbanist content. So if you don't want to shatter your rosy image of Montreal, you can pretend that the video is done right now. First, some context. Montreal is on an island, but that island is chopped up by highways, and some of these highways cut right through the center of the city. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with highways. They're a great way to move vehicles from point A to point B quickly and efficiently. When highways are used correctly, they divert traffic away from city streets and onto the highway. But highways should go around cities, not through them. And the problems come when highways are used to funnel tens of thousands of cars onto city streets. And that is exactly the way highways are misused in Montreal. There were so many places where I found car sewers connected to highways. This highway even has its own backup highway next to it. This was one thing I really noticed about Montreal, especially when cycling. There are highways everywhere. In some places, they try to make it as safe as possible for people cycling, which is great. But it still amazed me just how much land on this island is dedicated to highways and related infrastructure. These highways were built in the 1950s and 1960s when elevated expressways were all the rage. But now they're crumbling and nobody wants to pay the billions of dollars required to repair them. Historically, Montreal was an island of streetcars. Look, there were so many lines that they overflowed outside of the map.
Call them trams.
This means that a large part of the island is one big streetcar suburb with medium-density mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. Of course, all of these streetcar tracks were torn out to build car infrastructure in the 1950s and 60s, and this is the source of most of the problems with Montreal today.
I'm going to stop there. I really love the fact that he mentions trams in Montreal and why he calls them streetcars. They're trams. Montreal at the time, at its height in the 1920s, had about 500 kilometers of tram lines, and which took about 200 million trips a year, which is insane for the time. Montreal's metro system today approximately has a ridership of a bit more than 200 million. So imagine 100 years ago, we had that many people riding the trams a year in the city. So I love the idea of trams. Trams do a very good job at efficiently moving people short distances. They help people get on and get off at the right times. It improves business traffic and obviously incomes and so on. And it's a very efficient way to move people. And if I could wave my magic wand again and bring something back from the past, it would be trams in Montreal. Imagine St. Catherine Street, entirely pedestrianized, car-free from Atwater to, let's say, Papineau, with a tram going through it and, moving people along. That would be amazing. 12 months a year. Sign me up. I'd love that. Bring back trams.
Or what sane countries call trams are extremely efficient for urban transportation. When you remove streetcars from a street and turn the street over to only cars, you significantly reduce the capacity of the street. So if you had a lane that could move over 5,000 people per hour by streetcar, you now have a lane that can only move around 1,000 or 2,000 people by car. Of course, the problem with cycling on smaller streets in North America is the ridiculous number of stop signs. Sorry, I mean arrêt signs. Thankfully,
Cheeky.
Montreal cyclists ignore stop signs, which they should, because stop signs are stupid and should not be used in this way, as I've talked about in a previous video. But of course...
Okay, I would love to see that video. If anybody has a link to that video, please put it in the comments. I want to know the context of his statement, because it's kind of irresponsible to say stop signs are stupid. They're not. They're there to keep everyone safe. For the record, kids, if you're watching this, obey traffic laws, stop at stop signs, look both ways before you cross, use crosswalks, use the intersection, be safe. Drivers, do the same. We're sharing the road. That's the whole idea. You have to share the road between different modes of transport, and everybody has to be safe, both for themselves and for other people. So if you're biking in Montreal or any other big city, stop at the red light, stop at stop signs, or at least slow down and look both ways. Don't assume that because you're a cyclist, people are going to know that you're coming and they're going to stop for you. Be safe. You're the first person responsible for your safety, in my opinion. I know a lot of people will disagree with that, but I mean, I think it's reasonable to expect people to obey traffic signals while they're using the road.
This is technically illegal, and it means that any bored cop looking to fill his quota can ticket you for it at any time. I also noticed that a lot of the protected bike paths in Montreal were two-way. These are sometimes called bi-directional bike lanes. There's a reason why traffic engineers do this, because putting the bike lanes together lets them get a little bit of extra space for bikes without taking space away from cars. And on multi-lane one-way streets, car lanes can be slightly closer together, which also leaves a few extra centimeters to make bike lanes wider, again, without taking space away from cars. But these kind of lanes can be dangerous in certain situations and probably should not be used on a street like this. Bidirectional cycling paths are not recommended on streets with a lot of cross streets and driveways, as drivers are not expecting to look for traffic coming from the opposite direction. This relatively minor intersection in Toronto is one of the most dangerous for cyclists in the whole city for exactly this reason. This bidirectional path near the waterfront in Montreal has long stretches between cross streets, and this is a reasonable design, though it does suddenly end with a walk your bike sign. And this bidirectional path was recently removed and replaced with wider one-way bicycle paths on either side of the road, which is a safer long-term solution. I definitely felt like there were way too many cross streets on most of these two-way cycling paths though, and without any protected intersections, of course. In some cases, Montreal mitigates the danger of lots of cross streets by having a stoplight at every intersection, which is really annoying. I ran into so many red lights when cycling in Montreal, which made cycling very slow. But I generally prefer taking transit over cycling anyway, and while I was checking out the new REM trains, I met up with these two guys who were in town doing the same thing. Bunch of transit-loving
that's Reese from RM Transit. Excellent.
But the truth is, the majority of Montreal is not like this. It's more like this. Is this still better than most of the US and Canada? Yes, absolutely. And the city is definitely improving. But I remember sitting on this bus as it slowly trudged through traffic, and I seriously considered titling this video, "The Most Disappointing City I've Ever Visited." But that's not really fair to Montreal, because my expectations were just set too high from what I had seen online, and besides, I was saving that title for Philadelphia. I feel like Canadians have been gaslighting me about Montreal. I've been repeatedly told it's just as good as the best European cities, and there's lots of content online suggesting that too. I'm sorry, but these people are just wrong. I spent a week in Montreal, and I traveled extensively throughout the city, and I saw a lot of great things, and some very, very promising improvements. And I cannot stress enough how great these pedestrian streets are. But I also spent over $100 in taxis in a single day, because public transit was so bad outside of the core region. And I ended up in a lot of places where I didn't feel safe walking or cycling, and spent a lot of time stuck in traffic, even on public transit. And all this in what I've been repeatedly told is one of the best cities in North America. Montreal really made me lose interest in making any more videos about US or Canadian cities. It's just not worth the time, cost, and frustration. And ultimately, I don't think Montreal is a great city. It's more like 5 good neighborhoods in a trench coat pretending to be a great city. But even I do have to admit, it's still better and improving faster than other Canadian cities, so it does have that going for it. So if you're a Canadian who appreciates good urbanism, someone who doesn't want to spend most of their waking hours surrounded by asphalt or behind the wheel of a car, someone who appreciates human-sized places, and if you're able to find a way to live and work in one of the great walkable islands, then you could really carve out a great life for yourself here in Montreal. Just, don't walk 2 blocks south.
Right. Well, there are a lot of great things this video does. Points out a lot of very impressive and important things that Montreal does, and is very good at doing, and points out a lot of very bad things about Montreal, especially when it comes to transit. The fact that we take a bus to and from the airport is frankly embarrassing, and I can't wait for 2027 for that to be fixed. But it's extremely true that Montreal has a lot of highways. Definitely, Montreal has done a lot of improvements when it comes to active transportation like cycling, and the REM is going to really change the way people travel across Montreal. I'm really looking forward for it to extend to the airport so that we can get rid of that bus. It's an eyesore. It's really embarrassing. Pedestrianized streets, as they mentioned in the video, is a fantastic phenomenon. It just has wins across the board. Everybody benefits from it. So I really hope a lot of other cities do the same, because it really revitalizes a lot of sectors of the city that otherwise were forgotten, especially from a commercial standpoint. Overall, though, although Montreal has a long way to go before achieving like this European standard that the creator of this video was mentioning, it's really not fair to compare the both. Montreal is a gigantic city in terms of area compared to most European cities, especially compared to Amsterdam. Montreal is about 40 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide. You can't go from one end to the other of the city by bike. Physically, it's not really possible for most people. It's unfair to compare it because of also the geography. Montreal is very hilly. Amsterdam is very flat. The climate, Montreal has about 8 months in the year where cycling is, for 95% of the people, undesirable. You won't want to cycle when there's 2 meters of snow and when it's minus 30 outside. Amsterdam does not have that climate impediment. So it's really unfair to assume that Montreal's solutions to its transit obstacles or challenges should be the same as Amsterdam. Every city should be able to adapt to its culture, to its conditions, to its geography, to its history, to its society, even to its values. So I don't think it's right to judge Montreal on the standard of Amsterdam. And that's one thing I found confusing about the creator in this video, is the premise of the video was Montreal is the best city in North America. And even after discussing all of the, let's say, cons of Montreal, the creator still says that Montreal is one of the best cities in North America, but then says it's disappointing because he feels like he was misled by a lot of people. And he tries to compare it with Amsterdam, which, like I said, is a very unfair comparison. Montreal's, let's say, golden age coincided with the age of the automobile, which made it so that a lot of its infrastructure construction was based around the automobile, and it takes time to change that infrastructure and adapt it back to more human scale living. Whereas Amsterdam and a lot of, most European cities saw their golden age of growth before the car was even invented. And similarly, the same way you don't have, let's say, in Amsterdam, the central area, the old town, completely destroyed to make way for cars, is the same reason you don't have very bike-centric or walking-centric or horse and carriage-centric architecture and infrastructure in Montreal. So you can't really compare the two on the same level. In any case, I really hope you enjoyed my reaction to this video. I recommend you go watch the video yourself on Not Just Bike's YouTube channel. And address it as you see fit. And if you do want to support my work and want to contribute to the success of this channel, you can follow my Patreon. The address will be in the description of this video. Until next time, I'm Shant, reminding you to keep your urbanism friendly.